Welcome everyone to the next episode of Bones and Stones. Today we have a guest coming to us from Italy, from an active volcano, we've just been told. Brian Stewart is joining us. He does apologize. He said if the volcano goes off and he disappears, he's sorry, but hopefully it doesn't happen. We'll see. But thanks very much for coming to us, Brian, from Italy. We really do appreciate it. Today, we thought we'd kick things off to talk just a little bit about your recent paper on the strontium isotopes and ostrich eggshell beads. That's really cool work coming out of Lesotho, and what you guys have been able to show in terms of large landscape-wide connections is pretty incredible. Do you mind if we could just kick off telling us a little bit about that paper?
Yeah. I mean, this came out of wanting to test quite a specific targeted hypothesis raised by, I don't know if it was Peter Mitchell or Aaron Mazel. Peter's at Oxford, Aaron's at Newcastle now. I don't know really who was the first to put this forward, but effectively they were noticing a pattern in their respective regions. Peter in the highlands of Lesotho, Aaron in KwaZulu-Natal, the Tugela Basin in that area. And it was very different from other parts of Southern Africa, where you usually have huge amounts of ostrich eggshell fragments, broken fragments, usually from water flasks or just from egg meals. And then usually lots of bead making debris, because these things would break down, of course, as you guys all know, and the fragments are used to create these beads, ostrich eggshell beads. And usually you find massive amounts of unworked eggshell and residue from bead making, and then relatively fewer beads, in the greater scheme of things. And in these areas, in these southeasternmost parts of the subcontinent, you find the opposite. You find lots of beads or numbers of beads, and very little, if any, of these kind of residues of bead making or unworked eggshell. And this kind of, it shouldn't be much of a mystery. These are not habitats that ostriches today or in the recent past would have been likely to inhabit. Just habitat preferences of ostriches are usually quite semi-arid to arid, relatively level landscapes. These are all broken landscapes that are relatively humid for the subcontinent. So one thing they were able to kind of say in a tentative way is these things probably were introduced, these beads, because if they weren't, you would expect to find the fragments and residues of their manufacture. And of course, this is areas where ostriches don't like to live, so that kind of backed it up. But it was impossible to say anything further, where they were coming from, whether they indeed were introduced, and so on. And so, for years I've been thinking about how to test this, and I began, I thought about using strontium a while ago. It was kind of inspired by some of Stan Ambrose's attempts. He's at University of Illinois, as you guys know, and he's sort of worked on this in East Africa, but it hasn't had a lot of success, I think, because of the geological diversity and complexity of that area. And what we have in the southeast is just this beautiful layer cake it's called the Karoo supergroup, and it's basically it's like a geological bullseye where you've got these high Jurassic basalt, this cap that basically is the highlands of Lesotho and the Drakensberg escarpment. And then as you go down from that, you get successively larger and older geological formations, and strontium should increase. And the strontium is basically taken up by ostriches and everything else in their diet. And are you guys still with me?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Okay, good. And so you can theoretically, figure out, from which of these layer cake strata an ostrich was living, and therefore you can kind of get a vague idea of distance from which these things were moving in. So that was the kind of inspiration, and we did a pilot study, and which we can talk about more, and then I'll stop talking. But and it showed in the beginning, it just showed unbelievable, huge statistical difference from our background signature from things like soil and plants and water, and the ostrich eggshell beads from that same landscape up in the highlands. And so we could clearly see that these things were highly exotic, and then we took it further and tried to figure out where they were coming from.
So what struck me, I mean, it's like you said earlier, it's not much of a mystery. They're not coming from locally. So you knew if you dig up shell up there, it's coming from somewhere else. What struck me as really interesting with your findings was some of your results were putting the ostrich eggshell coming from distances at more than 300 kilometers. I think it was like 340 or something like that, which is really a massive.
325.
Yeah, it's huge. And so if you talk, I know like Larry Barham talking about Sophiso shelters, talking about 100-kilometer distances of hematite being moved, and Todila Hills also large distances. But that is, that's a lot bigger, and it's also was it 33,000 years ago?
Yeah, yeah, that surprised us. I mean, we were sort of hoping to show that these things were not local and were coming from some distance. But once we started getting some of these values, it was clear that these things were not coming from 1 or 2 geological strata away, but 3 or 4 or beyond. And that's the other thing is that, we've got some of these very high values. There's 3 or 4 beads that are just off the charts. And those, the minimum distance for those is 325 kilometers. And that's just based on pure GIS straight line value data to the nearest outcrop of that particular stratum of the Karoo supergroup. But it could be coming from much further than that.
Yeah.
It could be coming from 600 to 700 kilometers out.
Yeah.
We don't know. So that's why we'd like to throw another isotope at this to really start to refine and pinpoint some of those regions beyond these minimal.
So then, I mean, it's really cool, and I think those distances, they're probably not sort of to be unexpected, because I know, like, in the Bambata pottery, for example, that's passing what seems to be passing through massive channels as well over huge distances. But here you've really got some nice evidence to tie it into landscapes. So if you're able to tie it up further, do you think with this type of evidence, because I know in the paper you're quite careful of how you word these things, but do you think you can start to look at social networks through these connections and possibly even social systems like gift exchange, Karo gift exchange, with this type of study?
I do. Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to take a lot more work. South Africa is quite good in terms of strontium because it's got these, very strongly differently aged geological formations abutting each other. And they're not too small, so it doesn't get really confusing as to which one they're coming from. And they're not too gigantic. They kind of have a correct kind of geometry. And so when I showed it to my strontium, my super strontium specialist, where I'm based at the University of Michigan, they took one look at it and they were like, this is where it works. This is the kind of place.
That's cool.
And so I think we have a lot of huge potential for doing a much larger study. We started in Lesotho just because it's such a clean test. It's a very nice, clean laboratory for doing this. But we've just put in a grant, myself, Alex McKay at Wollongong, and Genevieve Dewar at University of Toronto, and Chris Ames also at Wollongong, to the Australian Research Council to do a much larger, really subcontinent-wide study, very similar to ours, but on a bigger scale, and looking at sort of multiple 3 or 4 transects diverging, from the Western Cape into the interior, from the Northern Cape down into the interior, and from Lesotho and those Eastern Highlands into the interior, to try to do a bigger thing, to look at wider potential. So yeah, I'm pretty hopeful, especially if we start to get another isotope involved. We need to figure out which one is going to work. They all have their drawbacks. And that might, anyway, we can talk about that further, but yeah, I think especially if we can get some multiple axes on there, we've got a lot of, great potential there.
Brian, thanks very much. This is really interesting. I'm actually going to throw Tim under the bus here because we were both working in Lesotho in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, doing some work up in the Basalt Highlands. And I mean, it's such an incredible landscape, and the archaeology that was coming out of there, and that is still coming out of there, is absolutely incredible. But the one find which was really interesting for both of us, and Tim, I'm sure you could talk to this a little bit more, was the Kona shell that we found. And that was obviously clearly an exotic item that had been brought in, from the coast. Tim, I can't remember what the straight line distance was, but I mean, it was over 200 k's, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, I don't know if we have chronology on that item now, but I mean, that again just talks to this kind of, distance in terms of where these items are being brought in from.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I remember that there's a wonderful picture of Captain of Retabile. That's the late great Captain holding that. It was really touching when I saw that on one of your Facebook pages. Yeah, and those things up there shouldn't be too surprising. Again, Peter Mitchell found marine shell at both Sahonghong and his sites in the Putitsana Valley that go right back to the LGM. And that's, as you say, it's over 200 kilometers. So these distances are not unknown. I think the ostrich eggshell study is cool because what it does is it expands those connections further inland. And for me, what that's saying, and this we touch on a little bit at the end of the paper, is one can imagine a situation where hunter-gatherers in the interior Karoo, who live in a relatively unstructured landscape, as sort of Tony Humphreys has said, who live in an area that, as you guys all know, the Karoo is freezing cold in the winter time. There's not a huge amount of water around. Water is very fickle. It's a tough place to make a living. And, as the climate was changing quite rapidly, especially in the late Quaternion, especially in the late Pleistocene, I think creating connections both within that area, but especially to people that were living in better watered places with more stable resources would have been pretty fundamental. So for desert hunter-gatherers to connect up into those peripheral highland areas in southern Africa, I think it would have been very important. But it's true that also there were clear connections with the coast, and whether those are a different kind of social connection, as something that's not as similar to Haro or those allied practices in the Kalahari of gift exchange, or whether that was, those were exotic artifacts for something like status symbol or amulets for shamans or something. I don't know if the quality of exchange between the highlands and the coast was similar to the highlands and the desert. So that's something that I think it's really worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, it did strike us, because up in those landscapes up there, so we about 200 meters or so higher than Sahonghong from an altitudinal perspective, and firmly in the basalt. A lot of the conversation we had, and you'd know this better, because it's, you've been thinking about these things and working in these landscapes a lot more than we had and have. But as a team, we thought this place was a seasonal area. So we were expecting to see periodic entries from people and then retracting out of those landscapes because it's so extreme as well, and so cold and snowy and various other reasons. And yet when we started digging these funny little sites that are small in the basalt, you couldn't fit a small car on the platform that the shelter offered you. Okay, obviously we've got to look at the deposition as well, but present day. And suddenly you dig up, a perforated conus shell, or all these glass beads. We had glass beads coming up, and it really knocked us a little bit because we thought, wait a minute, what's actually going on up here? And a lot of your other work has sort of spoken about and examined paleoclimatic conditions. And so if maybe we can talk a bit about that as well, in terms of Lesotho and what these changes have been occurring over the last few thousand years and the impact that's had on human occupation patterns in the region.
I'm so glad to hear that you say that, because that's been our experience as well. That's exactly our experience. We were coming in from a Pat Carter framework for obvious reasons, obviously influenced by, filtered through the Peter Mitchell filter. Obviously for listeners that are not familiar with the area, Pat Carter was the first professional archaeologist to work up there. He was married to Patricia Vinicum, the famous rock art specialist, and they were sort of trying to do quite an innovative rock art, dirt archaeology package. But Pat very much came out of the University of Cambridge school of Eric Higgs and David Clark, and all about seasonal migration, very similar to what John Parkington was doing in the Western Cape or Hilary Deakin was doing in the Southern Cape. And so, it was all based around modeling, dispersals in and out, probably seasonal to that area. And so we were looking, we didn't have any seasonal indicators that we could use. We still don't. Actually, it's one of the great drawbacks, and we're working on that now with various teeth, with serial sampling of teeth. But what we found was something that we feel pretty strongly is not seasonal. It's just not seasonal. At least, and I don't, the basalts, if that's not seasonal, I would be surprised. And I believe you that it might not have been. Sahonghong and Medicani are not. I don't think. Maybe at certain times when things got really, really nasty, they became. But what the pattern shows, Peter and I recently did a radiocarbon dating paper, sort of compiling all these dates and looking at them and sort of putting them in paleoclimatic context. And the amazing thing that came out is that, especially in the highlands, was the resilience of human occupancy in that area. It's just crazy. Like they never were gone. They were only gone during the LGM, as far as we can tell, and during the Younger Dryas. And the rest of the time, there's just people up there. It's like they're just living up there.
Yeah.
So, and that speaks to, I think, a larger realization, mountain or montane context all around the world, is that these used to be thought of as marginal environments, very challenging for human occupation, very, very difficult for all sorts of reasons, cold, food was scarce at certain times of the year. And some of those, without question, are and were. But what time and again, even in places like the Andean Altiplano, right, or Highland Ethiopia, the pattern that's coming out is the pattern we have in Lesotho, which is that once people can figure out how to do it, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
They're going to stay there because there's things up there that they want.
Yeah.
And Lesotho, you've got amazing water, you've got incredible, animal and plant life based on that water. You've probably got lots of medicinal plants. You've got amazing raw material for stone. And you can get these things with relatively low, you don't have to move very far because things are vertically stacked.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty sweet place.
Yeah, and that you bring in the mobility issue. That was something we also thought about, and and it just shows, it comes from your own perspective. And so when we got there, we thought, how are you going to move around this landscape? It's rivers, it's channels, it's things like this. After being there for a short period of time, watching people with their cattle and their livestock going up and over ridges like there was no tomorrow, we realized our concept of mobility is probably very different to the way people operated. Sorry, Lotta, so you've got a question.
Yeah, no, thanks. I couldn't actually believe how people traverse that landscape just so easily.
Amazing.
Especially, the herdsmen, with their cattle and stuff. But just to talk about the seasonality aspect as well, I suppose there is still that aspect that is, represented if we look at perhaps some assemblages where you have fish bones which are preserved, and you could look potentially at, the representation of juveniles versus adults, and then tie that into seasonal aspects as well. And then also, talking about these upper kind of highland areas as landscapes that, originally coming in, you think, okay, these were, no, there would have been marginal areas, there wouldn't have been areas that would have been occupied all the time. But then when we were up there as well, we noticed, ESA and MSA assemblages when we didn't expect to find them. And, you'd think, at least from an ESA perspective, that there's no way there'd be, in those kinds of landscapes that early on. But we found the artifacts, you know what I mean? So the artifacts are there that say otherwise.
Can I ask you a question? What in that area up in near Podehadi and Mokotlong in that area, what did those ESA artifacts look like that you were finding?
Well, extremely one site. We found one site, and I think Matt, it was a scatter in a field mostly, and on the outskirts, But
tied to raw material source, very kind of ephemeral scatter. The context as well was obviously very, very poor. Most of the assemblage was actually preserved within a plough zone of a field. So you could see it being quite heavily disturbed. But the main thing in that area is that there was a pretty significant raw material outcrop of some pretty high quality raw material, in comparison to the rest of the basalt there, with a lot of those phenocrysts, and it tends to crumble away. So there was a rather, kind of high quality raw material source nearby, and then we had the artifacts nearby as well. So,
did you find any hand axes? Any small bifaces?
We found some.
I don't think we did. It was mainly,
but nothing
was large flakes.
Yeah, it was large flakes. There was some cores, very large cores, discoidal cores. And we had a couple pieces which had been worked by facially, but they didn't have, they weren't, none of us felt that they were hand axes,
Okay. Yeah. Because I've been wondering around about this for a long time. So one of my big research interests, just because of the time depth of some of the sites that we've got, and we're about to excavate. We got an NSF grant from National Science Foundation in the States to excavate at Hasaloja, which was another of Pat's sites. Yeah. It was his highest site. It's at similar altitude to the ones that you were working on up in Podehadi, but it's in the southeast corner down in Sislabetebe, in the Sislabetebe Basin. It's not it's weird. It's a high occurrence of the Claren sandstone, so it's not in the basalts. It's a very strange site, an incredible place. It's such a crazy place. It looks like Scotland. It's just mental. It's like, well, I'm sure it's similar to what you guys were working in. It's so amazing.
Yeah.
But that site has real potential to go down, I think, beyond, well into MIS5, hopefully, and maybe even earlier. I don't know. It has, I think it's got a lot. It doesn't have great potential for organic preservation. like Sahong or anything, but it has some interesting potential for time depth. And one of the things and the reason that's attractive to us is because we're interested in these first peopling processes. The exact question you guys were just raising, when were people up there? What were they doing up there originally? How did that process play out? And what does that say about, I very much hesitate to say modern human behavior, but what does it say about the progression of adaptive flexibility or plasticity within our clade, or the clade that, that came, or, the Heidelbergensis sapiens clade in general. And one thing that we've noticed from looking at Pat's work, from looking at our relatively limited landscape work, is that when we find ESA and it's diagnostic, in other words, it's not just big flakes and so on, but, we actually do have we got some, larger bifaces. Because a lot of stuff we think is ESA, but it's quite difficult to tell, sometimes, and we don't really know. As opposed to MSA, so MSA is littering the landscape up there. It's like the Karoo. It's just like, especially in those deeper river valleys, it's crazy. And ESA is very ephemeral, as you say. And the ESA we do have is the hand axes we have are tiny. They're really small. And I wonder, and that is that speaks to me of kind of a very late Acheulean signature. And so I wonder whether the first time people are really getting up there in any numbers at all, or even getting up there the first time at all, is at the, we're talking about after about 500,000 years ago, the last sort of 400 to 300,000 years ago. And that then, therefore, whether this isn't some, evolution into sapiens means moving up into landscapes that were previously not inhabited by previous hominins. So and that's a hypothesis. I don't know if that's true, cool. But it's not, we don't find any giant, Karoo style or Kuruman style, hand axes and stuff up there. We just don't have them. We don't have anything that looks Oldowan that I've seen that's convincing. So it does seem to me a very kind of a late Heidelbergensis to sapiens sort of time depth. That would be where my money is up there. But again, I might be wrong.
Yeah. Sorry, Brian. It's a really interesting point and a fascinating question. I think something that speaks to Lauder and myself, who are very intensely focused on the ESA. And it wouldn't be surprising to me that would be the case. I mean, obviously, one of the things about the sort of late Acheulean transitioning into the MSA, via the Forest Smith or Sangoan in some parts of Africa, is that we do see a huge diversity or increase in the diversity of the toolkits. And unfortunately, we don't have any of the sort of same types of remains, symbolic remains, if you will, that do suggest a sort of more advanced or complex cognition. But, we're talking about a different species in a different part of time that had its own unique sort of social structure, its own cognitive capacities, and so on and so forth. But the idea behind the sort of creation of blade toolkits, prepared core technology, and maybe that they were curating hand axes a bit longer, so such that the smaller the size, does have implications for reduction intensity, so on and so forth. It all does speak to me, at least, as that this is a time period when we're really starting to see the very first signatures of what we might call or brand something like a modern human cognitive behavioral complex. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy in saying that, but I do think that when Heidelbergensis comes along, is that the social complexity of those communities is probably far off the charts from when you would compare it to something like Oldowan. Whether Homo erectus was that sort of sort of behaviorally or cognitively complex still remains to be seen. But, like you say, we see a lot of Acheulean now starting to move into marginal environments like the Ethiopian highlands. Even at the site that I work at down at Amanzi Springs in the Eastern Cape seems to be very, very close to where the seashore is, and so these are starting to sort of populate in environments that are sort of known for modern humans much later in time. But very fascinating, insights that you're providing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that those are some great points. I mean, I think that the a bit like what John Shea wrote in his sort of kind of seminal paper in 2011. Homo sapiens is as Homo sapien was, I believe. I think that the key to this is not going to be in things like ochre in beads and engravings. I am totally fascinated by those things. Those are the coolest. Those have put the MSA on the map. And we cannot detract from how phenomenal and important they are for the evolution of cognition. But as the Australians like Jane Baum and these guys have argued, I think really cogently, there is a big difference between the beginning of a capacity for something and its expression. Mm. And what we're seeing at Blombos is an ultimate expression of something that occurred earlier that possibly didn't leave a clear, tangible, clean, straightforward material trace that we can go, aha, we have, we have modern human behavior here in this one thing. We're not going to get it like that, Those kind of firsts are not. Look at landscape population. Look at environmental possibilities, environmental possibilism. Those kind of all-encompassing, looking at foraging strategies and how those interact with climate and over what time frame, and those kind of more holistic, all-encompassing avenues of inquiry, I think are the things that are going to bear fruit. And so that's why Genevieve Dewar and I have really, we like the idea of looking at these difficult environments and looking at the timing of when people are getting up into them, Because how the hell are people able to shoot out of Africa when they did, now between 100 and 180,000 years ago or so, and with such competence and fluency and speed and grace and just, they're off to the races. Mm. And as soon as they get into any environment, they're masters quickly, and that speaks to an earlier evolutionary trial and error period within the continent of Africa. And I think to get at that, we need to start asking these kind of questions that you were suggesting.
Cool, thanks, guys. Well, I think we should sort of wrap it up there. It's really been a fascinating conversation with some really great ideas. Especially for me working in much more recent periods of time, it's really great to hear some of this. And every time I speak to someone who studies in this period of time, other than these two mats, I start to realize what they see in it as well. So, no, I'm just kidding. But thanks very much, Brian. That's awesome. Really interesting, and thanks for joining us. It's been a fascinating chat, and stay safe up there, and hopefully we get to chat to you and maybe even see you soon for a beer in the field or something.
Oh man, when beer becomes accessible again where you are, that's going to be a great day.
There's going to be I heard a rumor today that there's going to be an announcement this week. I think we'll all be holding our fingers.
Oh. Yeah. I'll hold my thumbs. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I really appreciate you guys having me on. It was super fun, and keep up the great work. It's a great series.
Cool. Thanks so much.
So the next time you're doing field work in Lesotho, just let us know, because Tim and I are always trying to get up there, mainly for the fishing. So just let us know whenever you're getting up.
And Slabatebe definitely has some great fishing. You're more than welcome to join us at any time.